Good evening, everyone. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'd like to thank you for joining tonight's conversation. We're here to highlight the work of two of America's most incisive thinkers, whom I'll introduce shortly, and to celebrate City Journal, the Institute's flagship publication and home of the nation's most daring, intellectually serious journalism. Tonight's event is prompted by the publication of a special edition of City Journal titled, "Can California Be Golden Again?" A comprehensive look at the myriad cultural and policy challenges facing this vitally important state. There should be a copy waiting for you on your seat. To those of you who are new to City Journal and the Manhattan Institute, we're an organization dedicated to keeping America and its great cities prosperous, safe, and free. To that end, we recruit the nation's most fearless scholars to challenge the ideologues who dominate so many of the country's elite institutions. MI scholars offer a better way forward, one grounded in a commitment to individual liberty, economic freedom, and the rule of law. I'd also like to thank all those who supported tonight's event. We rely on the generosity of our supporters to produce events like this one, to ensure City Journal can reach the widest possible audience, and to provide our scholars with the tools they need to counter destructive policies and change the national conversation. We would be honored to have your support. You'll find cards on your seat with instructions on how to donate and make this critical work possible. Thank you for your consideration. And now I'm proud to introduce tonight's panelists, Christopher Rufo and Abigail Shrier. Chris is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, an accomplished documentary filmmaker, and I would argue the most impactful political and social activist in America. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, America's Cultural Revolution, which will be published this summer. Abigail is an award-winning independent journalist and the author of Irreversible Damage, a searing, prescient portrait of how transgender ideology is shaping the lives of teenage girls, and a forthcoming book on the larger mental health crisis plaguing America's youth. Her latest article for CJ, titled Predator's Paradise, is a disturbing account of how recent state legislation has sparked a boom in human trafficking and prostitution in California cities. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by my esteemed colleague, Brian Anderson, who serves as editor of City Journal and the host of its 10 Blocks podcast, a haven for intelligent conversation. Please join me in giving Brian and the panel a warm welcome.
Thank you, Raihan, very much. Very glad to be back in California and see some old friends here and a lot of new faces. Chris and Abigail have both called California home at various times in their lives. Abigail still lives here. Both have brought insightful analysis to the state's various challenges. So Chris, I'm going to start with you. Your reporting for City Journal has revealed a radical pedagogy that's increasingly commonplace in California's public schools. So from Sacramento to San Diego, elementary, middle, and high schools are advancing what we could call an identitarian creed that sorts students based on skin color and that is validating a host of new genders, basically. So could you describe the kind of underlying philosophy driving this trend and how it is manifesting itself exactly in the classroom? And how did California's political environment allow for this transformation to take place?
Great, yeah, well, you know, I did a series of stories on critical race theory in K-12 schools and then gender ideology in K-12 schools. And as I was soliciting sources and talking to many people all over the country, for better or for worse, California was at top of mind. And I had developed many sources in LA public schools, San Diego, Sacramento, San Francisco, and elsewhere. And what you see is that the most vanguard educational theories that filter down from kind of graduate schools of education, the first place where they get a foothold is in California. I think the larger structural reason for this is that there is no opposition in the state that has the power to put brakes on anything. And so what you see in the internal coalition on the Democratic left in a state like California that doesn't worry about competitive elections with Republicans is they worry about competitive elections with democratic socialists and Marxist-Leninists and, you know, gender ideologues. And so you see the center of gravity of the political life is so far to the left And then there's really no bulwark that has formed. These bulwarks kind of come up, they dissipate. They come up, they dissipate. And then you see even worse, you have external pressure leaves the state. And so you have a one-party state that resembles Central America much more than it does other parts of the United States as far as the contested political nature of things. And so what does this mean for K-12 schools to get to that point? It means that any fashionable left-wing ideology is taken from the very complex kind of academic paper style of discourse. It's distilled down into a PowerPoint presentation, a PDF document, K-12 lesson plans, digestible bits of content that are just distillations of the advanced academic theory, whether it's Marxist-Leninism, Black Panther Party ideology, BLM ideology, all of the different flavors that you might sample. They create this little content nodes. And what these content nodes are designed for are for K-12 teachers that may not want to read Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality papers in the Harvard Law Review. But if you give them a PowerPoint like the one in San Diego public schools that just said to white teachers, "You are racist," big capital letters, "You are racist." Well, all right, I get that. Tell me more. And so you have these ideas that are very consciously spread to K through 12 because they know that that's where the impressionable kids are. I did a story in Santa Clara County. They were taking third graders, dividing them up by race, telling certain students they were oppressors, other students they were oppressed based on their skin color. And then the teacher training, Santa Clara County Office of Education, I had a recorded Zoom call that was leaked to me, and they say very clearly, you have to get them when they're 4, 5, and 6 years old. You have to use kids' inherent empathy and hijack those feelings and those vulnerabilities in order to make them left-wing activists from the beginning. And so this is a concerted effort. It's now spread everywhere in the state of California, and the two major lines of attack are race and gender. This is, you kind of know this intuitively, but really that's where the theories hang. And so you have kind of Marxist ideology, Black Panther ideology, critical race theory, BLM ideology on one track. That's kind of the historical development. And then in gender, and Abigail would probably know the history of it better than I would, but is queer theory starting in the late 80s, early 90s, and then kind of transgender activism as its own discipline. And then what is, I think in a rather unfortunate way, they're taking some of the goodwill for gay and lesbian Americans, which, I think is part of our historical development. And they're saying, hey, we're going to take that goodwill and we're going to take it to inject really radical stuff into the classroom. This is stuff like teaching kids, some of the stuff you don't even want to say, but I mean, it's really, sex toys in the classroom. It's teaching kids how to do all sorts of, naughty things that I would be even a little embarrassed to talk to my own wife about. But they're teaching, 6-year-olds about it. And so that's the playing field. And I think the big question, which hopefully we'll get to, is what could be in a state like California possibly enough to start pushing back? That's the big question.
Abigail, you visited a notorious prostitution strip in South LA to conduct research for the essay Raihan mentioned, and it is a terrific essay. It's one of the more compelling things we've ever written and most disturbing things, called Predator's Paradise. So prostitution remains illegal in California, but sex trafficking has proliferated in the state recently, exploded really, as a result of a recently passed law that you describe in the article that is stymieing law enforcement's ability really to intervene in the sex trade. So can you explain what this law is, what its impact has been on women, and in particular younger women, and who is benefiting from this and who is responsible for it?
Sure. So in January, I took a ride with 2 women, one a former vice sergeant on Figueroa, which is only one of the state's very large and very active hubs of human trafficking, also known as prostitution or selling of people. because a lot of these are girls. They're not women. A lot of them are underage. And you know, it's one law. The law that was recently overturned was the anti-loitering with the intent to engage in prostitution statute. So this statute used to be able to, police officers used to be able to stop women who were in G-strings. These women were in G-string bikinis in the middle of the night, in the middle of the street. That's all they're wearing. And they're flagging down cars. And police officers used to be able to stop them and say, you look a little, how old are you? Do you need help? Because of course their pimps are standing really close. They're about a block over, and they're watching. These kids are basically slaves. And police can no longer make those stops because we overturned that statute. But it's only one of many statutes that have been passed lately in California that have been an enormous boon to sexual predators. There have been everything from in the last 4 years, we have decriminalized intentionally giving a sex partner as HIV. That was decriminalized. We have made California a sanctuary state for LGBTQ youth. You can come to the state and liberate yourself from concerned parents, as long as you say they weren't affirming of you. The court will take jurisdiction now. We have states that changed the sex offender registry, so no longer will a 24-year-old who has anal sex with a 14-year-old will no longer be placed on the sex offender registry. That was considered anti-LGBTQ. And I was able to interview Senator Scott Wiener for the piece. He is the author of almost every one of these laws, certainly every one that I just mentioned, or the sponsor. And in every case, like Chris was saying, they are done in the name of LGBTQ rights. Of course, the victims are often LGBTQ kids who show up here alone looking to liberate themselves, or are trafficked through our LGBTQ youth centers where a lot of trafficking occurs. And of course, they're the victim of the 24-year-old who had anal sex with them. So it's done in the name of LGBTQ, but of course, women and children, some of whom identify as LGBTQ, are the biggest victims. So that is the game they play. And unfortunately, a lot of well-meaning people there's something seductive to the idea, we care about civil rights, we care about civil rights for gay people in this country, and there's something seductive the second they mention LGBTQ, a lot of good people shut up. And they just don't, oppose anything. And all of these laws have been virtually unopposed. And I'll just add one more really quickly, because California is, as Chris was saying, is a model state for just how crazy things can get. And it really is a warning to every other state. We now have a bill in California and also in New Jersey that would make family court judges require them to give preferential custody to any parent who affirms a child's stated gender. So it effectively hamstring family court judges in custody determinations. This is what's coming to America, and it starts here. Anyway.
Yeah, it's extremely alarming. Chris, speaking of other states, you've been doing a lot of work in Florida, a place whose social, economic, and education policies are contrasting pretty dramatically with California's at the moment. So you've worked with the governor, Ron DeSantis, to craft legislation restricting some of these practices in the state schools that we've been describing. So earlier this year, you were appointed to the board of New College in Florida, the New College of Florida, and tasked, and there's another, Charles Kessler is here, who is another trustee now at that school.
Where's Dr. Kessler? There he is. Good to see you. All right, well.
Yeah, you've been tasked with helping anyway to transform it from an underperforming and radicalized public university to a traditional liberal arts school. And you've been working on model legislation intended to restore sanity, basically, from elementary school to the university. So what, in your view, and we'll obviously talk about this more, does it take to recapture these besieged public institutions, these schools in particular?
Great. I think it starts, obviously, first you have to win elections. That's something that, for some reason, we don't think of very often. Oh, when you win elections, you get to do stuff. And even in red states, I think what we've seen in the last 5 years, 10 years is you have these states that are 70% Republican, supermajority in the legislature, the governor wins by 50 points, and they're scared to do anything. And so I talked to the legislators, like, what are you guys scared of? You're in South Dakota, you're in West Virginia. I mean, you have a supermajority, and what it is that those smaller states are scared of the backlash from corporate America, scared of the backlash from the media, and scared of the backlash from activists. And so they feel like because of their small size, they've been held essentially hostage. If the NCAA pulls out, if the mining company gets upset, if their large hospital system that's part of a conglomerate starts to push back, they crumble. So Florida, and then to a lesser extent Texas, have the requisite size. And then, of course, Governor DeSantis has the requisite margin of victory to actually have a mandate. And so I've been fortunate enough to work with the governor and his team on a number of these initiatives to basically say we're going to go methodically, institution by institution, and start recapturing them in a substantive way, and start creating prohibitions on things we don't like, and start creating positive incentives for things that we do like. And this has kind of flown in the face even of our friends and allies that are more libertarian in spirit on the right. Well, we can't possibly meddle with the government institutions. And I try to explain to folks and say, well, hey, wait a minute. This is the government. You could say that you wish it didn't exist, but the fact is that it does. It's going to exist for the next for as long as we can imagine into the future. And so the question is not should we have very small government or very large government. Look, I agree. The government should be smaller. But until we get there, we have to actually govern it. We have to actually have policy. We actually have to have values and priorities that are embedded in the policies and practices of these institutions. And so we started with K through 12. The Stop Woke Act said no racial scapegoating, no categorizing people oppressed or unoppressed. Very simple things, honestly. If you look at the list of things, I mean, if you're doing any of the things in the Stop Woke Act, you're doing something really horribly wrong to kids. You're telling them that they're inherently guilty because of their ancestry. These are un-American. They're violation of the civil rights law. And then the governor said, we're going to get that out of the classroom. Second was gender ideology. They went K through 3, the first bill that passed. No teaching on gender identity, human sexuality, sexual orientation. K through 3, just lay off, They're 5 years old, And I always think, too, it's like, man, these are adults, the kind of activist types, that are desperate to talk about their sexuality with other people's kids. That, to me, is a bit of a red flag. And the Florida said, no, K through 3, get out. And the reaction was furious. I mean, the reaction was absolutely insane.
Why was it limited to 3?
Well, here's the story. And then that was a criticism. Why was it limited to K through 3? There's a new bill that's going through the legislature that's going to be K through 8. To say, you know what? Let parents teach kids. Yeah. Let parents teach kids. And then, it was a bit of a fight. But look, the governor, he knows how to read the polls. He looks at these policies. They're very popular. In Florida, they're very popular nationally. And what I think the other element that is essential is his courage. He stuck his neck out there. I tried to help to the extent that I could. And so now we're working up the chain from K through 12 to public universities, to state agencies. And really what we're going to do is design a series of policies to create an alternative model of governance that says these are our values, these are the ideas and principles and priorities that we want to transmit through the government. And the ultimate thing, and I think what the predicate of this, the kind of constitutional basis of this is, the people have every right to regulate their own government. And if the left tells us, you can't determine what's in the classroom, you can't take over public universities, you can't do this, you can't do that, what they're saying in essence is, we want to let you win elections, but any action that you take to shape the public life is illegitimate, and we're going to try to take it away from you. And so this, to me, is not just a test of do you want critical race theory, do you want gender ideology, do you want kind of zombie studies in universities? It's a test of do we have a meaningful democracy still? And I hope that the next couple of years prove that we do, and that inspire other people around the country to actually win elections and then govern it to the best that they can.
Thank you. Chris, Abigail, in your book you talk about the transgender craze holding so much influence over American children. You wrote this a few years ago. 3 times as many children were diagnosed with gender dysphoria in 2021 as in 2017, when you were probably starting the book. So what is the evidence that points to this phenomenon, this incredible shift, being an example of a natural development, as some people are arguing, or as a form of social contagion?
Oh, it's very obviously a social contagion. That should have been completely uncontroversial. I mean, look, we're all subject to social contagion. That's what it means to be human to some extent, right? This is not a surprise. So teenagers especially, and teenage girls, feel uncomfortable in their bodies at that age. They tend to be very susceptible to things like social media influencers and their woke teachers and their woke therapists. And this became sort of the latest craze. It was the anorexia of our age. All that should have been relatively uncontroversial. The thing that made it controversial, of course, was that the gender activists were terrified that this message would get out. They didn't want parents to have actual information to be able to evaluate the medical procedures that were being touted for their kids. They didn't want doctors to be able to have any courage or to be able to stand up to these things. So you'll notice that there are very few doctors who do stand up under their own name. Honestly, it's really shocking and a little shameful how few doctors have stood up. There's one last thing about doctors. You know, they often come up to me and they'll say to me, you know, at conferences, do you think the medical malpractice suits will take care of this? And what they're saying is, can they take care of this so I don't have to say anything?
Yeah.
That's what they're saying. They're saying, I don't want to stick my neck out. I've got kids in college. Can someone else do this for me? And I say to them, look, I'm a journalist. You're a doctor. I can report on what other doctors have said, but of course it's not, I'm appealing to someone else's authority, right? But American doctors don't want to. They've watched all their professional organizations be taken over, just like lawyers have watched the ACLU taken over. But here's the funny thing. If they take over enough institutions, there's nowhere else to go. So now we're having judges. We're seeing our first woke judges. They're graduating medical school. Numberless med school graduates are now woke. At some point, there won't be anywhere else to go, and there's no one else who's going to do the dirty work. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes. It's a very troubling situation. Let me ask a question to both of you. Chris, you earlier mentioned that California's outsized power culturally means that its policies, however crazy they are, consistently wind up getting emulated in jurisdictions across the country. And this is really for both of you. So culturally, too, California's example is incredibly influential. You've both, in your writing, exposed the detrimental effects of the California model. So, you know, can that model be changed here in California? And if not, how can it be prevented from defining the rest of the United States?
Ooh, I mean, that's a hard question. You know, I was born and raised in California. I grew up in Sacramento and lived in the Bay Area. I lived down here in the Los Angeles area, so I know California very well for many years. And it's a hard question. I don't have an answer to it because what I think we see is that a lot of the people who are the most capable end up fleeing. And people stick around, people have family, people have a business and whatnot, but I talk to a lot of people in high tech and people that would have the capacity to start seeding organizations that want to change. And I mean, they're all basically saying, my lawyer, you know, my lobbyists, they're watching the legislature. If they start going after my cash with a wealth tax, we're all ready to leave. All of us are building houses in Nevada. We're building houses in Texas. I have a couple houses in Miami. And so you see that it's very precarious. And the state itself is very precarious, given that it's so dependent on these very wealthy people. And you have serious discussions where you say, is it going to go the kind of Venezuela model, where things start to go a little sideways, they start to try to take assets, and all the productive and capable people flee, putting into a negative spiral. That's one possibility, certainly. The other possibility, and I think it really is a possibility, is someone has to be willing to step up. And I think what's happening with doctors on the gender ideology and kind of trans medical care surgeries is happening here in the same manner, but it's also happening on a bigger scale on every issue. I just don't think that you can have the homelessness crisis that California does, the cost of living crisis. I mean, it's crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis. And this only works if two things hold. One is that the political left suppresses reality, where you can say, hey, I don't think that having tents full of drug addicts sleeping outside of my kid's elementary school is such a swell idea. And then they hit you so hard that most people, good, well-meaning people, will say, well, that's not a problem because there's not something for them, or they should have a house instead of or they're not drug addicts. Actually, there's no evidence of that. I mean, they've created a reality suppression machine that is so powerful that people spew obvious lies. I mean, very obvious, like Soviet Union level lies. And that passes as conventional wisdom. They fact check these lies and say that they're actually truths. I mean, it's a whole machine. And so I think what would have to happen is some people would have to get together with significant means, put their money where their mouth is, but also take a significant reputational risk. And so when I have like private dinners with people in Silicon Valley or in nice parts of LA, they're always very private. They're always very like, don't tell anyone you're here. That can't hold. I mean, it really can't hold. And I think that the people that are rock stars in their field, the people that have high notoriety, people that have huge companies, the dam will break when enough of them stand up.
That's right.
And I feel like, look, you can talk about the Rockefellers and the Gettys and all these old families, and you could say they were very, naughty robber barons. But look at what they did. Look at the libraries that they built. Look at the museums that they built. Look at the great arts and culture and education and philanthropies and hospitals. I would say critics, and maybe there's some of you in this room, our billionaires, our plutocrats are nothing like that, and it's a damn shame. Yeah. And they really need to get started. Yeah. And look, I get it. You run a huge company. You're on boards of directors. You're famous, and you're going to get tarnished as anti-LGBT or racist or whatever. Someone's going to have the stones to say, you know what? F that. I'm done with that. I have enough money. Come, you can't touch me. I'm going to go hard at this. And so until we have leadership at that kind of level, we're journalists. We can't do it all. We can help. But we need to have some people that actually have the capacity and the power and the resources to mount an opposition. And look, we still have a free country. They may lie like it's the Soviet Union, but it isn't the Soviet Union. And so I just think that the biggest problem that's facing us is cowardice. Yeah. And I really believe that.
Well, Abigail, would you like to add your own experience here? You've had some suppression of your book for a while, although it wound up being a bestseller. And
my book's carried in almost no libraries in America. You cannot get it. People will donate it to America. It's the most requested banned book in Canada in the last 15 years. The suppression is endless. Target took it away and never brought it back. Look, the engines of suppression are pretty impressive. They're pretty advanced. My own take on the California question is there is no fixing California. But we can be an important example to the rest of the country. It's really important that the rest of the country know what happens here because it's coming for them. And as Chris said, we have a terrible problem of cowardice. I always think of the Golda Meir line, don't be so humble, you're not that great. And I think of it all the time because the number of people who say, oh, I just have to wait for this, I just have to wait for this. And I will say to them, I am quoting you on your expertise. You just have to tell me, is this a medically, prudent procedure? You don't have to tell me about politics. I'm just asking you to opine on your expertise, and they're afraid to do it. That's the kind of suppression that's sort of inexcusable. If you are a doctor, if you're a law professor, wherever you find yourself, you have an expertise. And if you can't comment on that, then we really don't have much free speech in this country.
Yeah.
One problem, Chris, with trying to leave California is that it comes after you. This is a little off topic, but just it's worth talking about your own experience with California
travails,
regulations.
Yeah. It's actually it's an interesting story, and it's actually in the issue that you have here. It's a diarist kind of column in the magazine, something I'd never done before. Like, no one wants to know about my personal life. But this was relevant because I started a nonprofit film studio in California in 2008. I did 4 documentaries for PBS. I sold a film to Netflix. I was in the documentary world. I did films here in LA and elsewhere. And then when I moved to Washington State, where I live now, I said, all right, well, I'll transfer the nonprofit corporation from California to Washington State because I don't have a mailbox down here anymore. I don't live here. And I said, all right, do the paperwork. And word comes back, no, you can't leave. I said, wait, what? Well, we don't re-domicile nonprofit corporations. You have to have a kind of, I don't even remember the technical term. The lawyer told me you have to have a kind of separate branch of the nonprofit that's like a mirror image organization, but you still have to file paperwork with California. All right, I'll do it. I have 2 entities. I'm filing double paperwork. It's like, I can't leave. All right. And then it comes to a point where the I kind of left my film career, kind of wanted to wind down the organization, started a new organization, started working with Manhattan Institute. All these bastards, I'm going to get them this time. I'm just going to shut it down. I'm going to file paperwork for dissolution, and I'll be gone finally. And then word came back, you can't do that either. You can't close down a nonprofit corporation until you jump through about 100 different hoops. And then as they take 6 months to get back to you, they hit you with other paperwork. And if you don't file the paperwork from the past into the future, which is impossible, then you have to start from the beginning. And I've been in this nightmare of trying to shut down a nonprofit organization for almost 2 years now. They won't let me leave. I keep getting fines. I'm running up thousands upon thousands of dollars in legal bills. I've left maybe 100 messages. Armin here on my team has also left many messages with all different offices. They run you in circles. And the point is, I think, and perhaps this is the case of when they talk about business closures in California. I bet you they're a lot higher, but they kind of keep these zombie entities alive forever. And they try to just milk you for everything that it's worth. And so I'm in a kind of Kafka novel right now with the state of California. I have like I'm C period, the initial only, and I'm going from office to office, and eventually I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble. That's really the end of how the story's going to end. So we'll see. I'll probably get some nasty letter from the Attorney General at some point. But it is really true, and I think that watch out. Watch out even if you decide to ever leave, because they're not going to let you leave, and they even have tax proposals saying that if you leave California, you have to pay taxes in California for 10 years subsequent to when you leave. It is a really nasty game that they play. So that's kind of a funny story.
It's yes, funny in a Kafka sort of way. I'd like to ask both of you, starting with you, Abigail, about the role of parents in the current climate, because this seems essential. You're both parents yourselves. The various phenomena you've written about can only, I think, truly be opposed through vigorous parental involvement, both in the sense of deeper involvement with your own kids and in terms of getting involved in opposing these trends in schools and other institutions and as citizens. But parents do face unique challenges today, I think. The cultural climate has made most people dread, and this has come up, being labeled as intolerant. And of course, we've got this ubiquitous technology from social media platforms to smartphones, which presents this massive obstacle now to moderating the influence of the broader culture on one's kids. So considering what we've been discussing today, I wonder, starting with you, Abigail, if you could boil down a message for parents today, what would it be?
Parents are the single most important group in this country right now. Maybe they always have been, but they're especially true now. They are the only group that cannot be bought. Because when it comes for their kids, they are all the same. Almost every parent will do anything for their kid. And that's why, There have been a lot of things that conservatives have gotten very upset about, like drag queen story hour, okay? Now, obviously I would regard it as foolish to take your kid to drag queen story hour. But this issue, which has exhausted so much attention, is probably, I don't know, 1/100th, 1/1000th as important as the issues of custody, which is now being eroded across the country. I'm working on a piece on this now, but the amount of assault on parent custody coming from every direction in this country through the state court system is really shocking. It's very alarming, and it's a much greater threat to the country, to our kids, than drag queen story hour. And I would just say this, as conservatives, I always try to think of like, what is the governing principle here? And I suppose my governing principle has always been that when it comes to things like gender ideology, parents generally know what's best for their kid, and they can be generally trusted to take care of their own kids, even if we disagree. The problem, the real threat to everybody, is when the state interposes itself between the parents and children. And that's what it's increasingly doing, certainly in this state, in all three branches of government.
Chris?
I think two things. First off, you have to be prudent about your own family, your own kids. I have 3 kids at home. You have 3 kids at home, and I think that the first step is to secure a kind of barrier around your own kids. And what that means, sometimes it means finding a better neighborhood, a better city, a better state. It certainly means finding a school that is not only going to not oppose your values, but actually affirms your values and helps transmit your values. I have my own kids. We're finally in a great school, conservative, classical, Catholic school. The priest on Sunday does the homily that's critical race theory is against the Word of God. And then we have 5 Dominican nuns, and they're always saying, Chris, we're praying for you on the gender thing. And so it's like, and they don't let the kids have cell phones, even in their private life when they're in their K through 8. And so we found a community that is a kind of oasis that has a protective barrier. It's like a walled garden, right? That metaphor of the walled garden. And where we feel like our kids can have a real childhood, they can have innocence, they can have friendships, and they can be protected for as long as possible from some of not only the vicious ideologies, but really the vicious people. Because some of the stuff that I've uncovered in my reporting, no conscientious and good-hearted person would be doing. And then you see that it's actually the policy of the government in these places to be pushing this stuff. And so I think that's number one. You have to protect your own kids, and do whatever it takes. But number two, and this actually hit home recently, I was rereading John Locke's second treatise. And Locke's, Kessler would appreciate that. But he has a line in there that really kind of shook me, and he said, ultimately the law is more powerful than the family. And I said, wait a minute, is that true? And kind of grappled with it, and I think ultimately he's right. And so you can't just say, I'm going to protect my own family, and then everything is going to be fine. I think what he's saying implicitly is that the social norms of the community, the social compact, the rules of the road, the rules of behavior, the set of values that we all live by, has an enormous power over the individual lives that in the aggregate is even more powerful than an individual family, which can try to protect against it. And so what that means, I think, is that we all have a duty, not just to protect our own, not just to protect our little communities, but to really fight for the public in public life. And ultimately, look, we have a massive government in the United States. We spend more as a percentage of GDP than communist China on our public sector. We're more socialist, quote unquote, than the Marxist-Leninist government of the PRC. And so what that means, certainly in the near term and the medium term, is we have to fight for it. We can't abdicate. We can't say that we're satisfied with libertarian thinking. We have a government. We have public schools. We have public universities. Look, 90% of kids are in public K through 12. 75% of college students are in public universities. And so if you're not fighting so that those things transmit the right set of values, you're going to be losing in such a catastrophic way that the country will be unrecognizable in a generation. And so what we're trying to do in Florida, there's a bill in the legislature right now that is going to be a big fight, but we're saying, you know what, pseudoscientific, kind of non-rigorous activist disciplines such as critical race theory, gender studies, queer theory, critical ethnic studies, it would wipe out all of those majors and minors in every public university in the state of Florida. Just say, gone. And it would do a number. It would basically say the public has a right to regulate the government, and the transmission of values is critical. And again, going back to Locke and the founders, freedom is not license, right? Freedom does not mean the license to do whatever you want. Freedom has to be ordered. It has to be towards something higher. In some ways, freedom is, or in academic freedom, freedom of speech, et cetera, are procedural values towards an end value. And so you have to get the ends right. And the work of government, the work of public discourse, the work of the public process is trying to figure out, well, what are we aiming towards? And can we set those values at the end? And then arrange our institutions in a way that leads towards those. And I think we've abandoned that for too long, and it's time for conservatives to start getting serious about it again.
I'd like to open it up for questions, but before we do, just quick two-sentence descriptions of your forthcoming books, Abigail and Chris.
My book is on...
Has a title yet?
Yeah, I do not have a title. I was not allowed to talk about title, but it's about the mental health experts' participation in the mental health crisis facing adolescents.
That's great. I look forward to reading that. So my book's coming out in July is the publication date, I think, with HarperCollins.
You do have a title.
Yeah, it's America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. And it's a 50-year look at the history of the Long March to the Institutions from 1968 to the present. It goes into the history, it goes into a bit of the theory, and then really draws on a lot of the reporting that I've done the last 2 or 3 years for City Journal and fleshes it out in much more detail. So the idea is to give people, citizens, parents, and policymakers a real understanding of what we're up against, a real understanding of how the left operates and how these ideas that were radical in 1968 are now suddenly in your kid's kindergarten classroom. And the one sentence, the one kind of thing that really shocked me was, if you read the Weather, you may remember Weather Underground, the left-wing terror organization, bombing the U.S. Capitol, et cetera. You read some of their pamphlets and manifestos. I was reading them for this book, and I was also reading California's K through 12 curriculum documents. They're not that different. And it's very darkly funny, but I'm really saying, and the language is different, the graphics are a little different, but they're not that different. And so the question is, how did that happen? And that's the question I answer in the book.
All right, well, we have time for some questions. Please wait for we have a microphone, and just briefly just say what your name is, and questions only, no long statements, so we get a few folks in.
Hi, this is wonderful. My name is Ginny Sand, wife of Larry Sand. You probably know him. I have just 3 words for you in terms of the influencers in California in tech, Vivek Ramaswamy and Palmer Luckey and Elon Musk. It's starting a little bit,
Yeah.
But my question, my question for you is, I'd like you to comment on. It seems to me that in terms of accountability and the bottom line issues, in terms of Bryn Mawr having a 4,000% increase in gender, LGBTQ. It seems like we've gone from. We were born this way. They argued for decades and decades that it wasn't a choice. We were born this way, to now almost half our kids are choosing to be this way. Clearly it's being promoted. It's being promoted in our schools, and can we hold them accountable for that?
Well, we created a vacuum. I really agree with everything Chris has said, and especially about our families. We created a vacuum in this country by not imparting the American religion. We left them susceptible to being converted to the woke religion. We didn't teach our kids in the last generation why the First Amendment matters, why it's a miraculous thing, the First Amendment. We didn't teach them why equal protection is so important. We didn't teach them why due process is essential. And so you have kids at Yale University who don't know. And what we're seeing in this abscess that we left behind is not hedonism. We're seeing a lot of really destructive isms in its place, a lot of really destructive religions. And one of them, of course, travels under the name LGBTQ, which is absolutely a proselytizing religion. We know that the numbers don't make sense in human history. Now, you now have 20% of the young rising generation identifying as LGBTQ. Now, humans have been around for a long time, and sexuality has been with us the entire time. And we know what, we have some sense of the figures, and we have a lot of sense that that doesn't make any sense. So we know that there's been a profound influence, a lot of social influence. And it really is an impetus towards all kinds of chaos. And I think that one of the key things to get back to is reasserting our own values with our children. They have to know what we believe in this household before they go out into school and hear what their teachers believe or what their teachers tell them. So I do think we have to create a bulwark with it absolutely has to begin with your own family.
Okay, let me go over to this side of the room. Gentleman in the middle row, and we'll rotate between sides here.
Hi, thank you. Kenneth Schrupp here. As someone who is Gen Z from California and willing to stay and fight for this state, what would you say I should do for planning my life forward to take this state back?
Well, God bless you, man. First of all, I mean, you got to have guts, and you're going to have to do things that are going to make you scared. And I went in the ringer. I got involved in politics in Seattle, and got my lumps. I got pushed around and beat up in Seattle, and it's very difficult. And as soon as you start having maybe some influence, they're going to come at you in a significant way that will get personal. It will get scary. And so first of all, I think you have to get through that. And then when you get through that, something kind of miraculous happens. You stop being scared. And then you start speaking your mind. And then you start feeling free. And so get through that as fast as you can. I waited till I was in my mid-30s, but some of these, I would say do that. And then the second thing is, again, we've got to get some people with extraordinary means to not just write the $100,000 check to Manhattan Institute, which you should all do later tonight, but to write the $100 million check. And I think that that's what it's going to take. I mean, if you look at even the gender activist organizations, the GSA Club, which sounds good in theory, I think comes from a well-meaning place in a certain regard. They're really pushing kind of gender Marxism, kind of this bizarre mashup between Marxism and gender ideology. They have 4,000 chapters in schools in the United States. The Gender and Sexualities Alliance, and they kind of send like platoons, little teams into elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. And then they have activist teachers that rally students. In their guidebook that I exposed for City Journal, they teach teachers how to talk in code with middle school kids so that their parents don't know that they're doing the trans activism. That's the kind of thing they're doing. And I think they have more chapters in California than any other state by a long shot. But the point is, though, is like it's going to take someone making a very serious effort. And so start small, start writing. I mean, I think the influence that we've had just from writing in San Francisco, our colleague Mike Schellenberger and others, I mean, the writing is start a Substack and write for City Journal and get on Twitter and do whatever. But I think that's the lowest cost, highest impact strategy. But ultimately, we're going to need organizations. We're going to need visionary leaders. We're going to need institution builders. At MI, we do a lot, but it's going to take many other partners to really take it back. And so, try to persuade someone to do that. That's what I would say. Yeah.
The woman in the by you there, yes.
Thank you. I have a question from a friend who has just bought your book, Abigail, and is having this problem in her life. And I'm going to read her own question, and I really appreciate your answer. How do you reach a 16-year-old boy who tells you that he's been exploring questioning his gender identity for about a year and changed his pronouns to they, them 5 months ago without telling you because he feels he doesn't fit into a bro culture? Sorry.
Okay, so
Good question.
there's a lot of parts of that. So first of all, parents absolutely can turn it around, but the younger they start, the better, okay? So a 12-year-old girl, a 13-year-old girl or boy is much more reachable, and they become much less reachable the older they get. 18-year-old, forget it. I mean, once they leave your house for college, if they want that mastectomy, they're gonna get it. And it doesn't matter how many times they promise they won't, they do it. But a few things. So I don't know if your friend has a husband around, but there are a few things. Men very often absent themselves the second a kid says something like that. They're uncomfortable, they're upset, it's their daughter, it's their child, they are freaked out. They very often take a giant step back from the child. I think it's a giant mistake. The parents who get right in front of it and fight for their kid tend to do much, much better. The parents who don't go along with this. Now, I'll tell you who does the worst. The white liberal parents have been the greatest sufferers from this phenomenon. And the reason is they were so gentle. Well, okay, she's exploring, we'll let her wear this clothes, I guess that doesn't matter. And they let the child saturate in this phony science and phony identity for a long time because they were genuinely sort of open-minded about it. What they don't know is that it leads to somewhere incredibly destructive. Now with boys, it doesn't tend, there just aren't the same numbers as the girls. It's not the chances of him giving this up are greater. The girls are really, they absolutely join the group and they're hard to get out of. And reasoning with them doesn't usually do it. This is not an intellectual thing. See, liberal parents, this is another thing they do. They're well educated and they show their kids 8 videos. Lectures. Let's sit down and watch this lecture and let's read these scientific articles. My daughter's very bright, she'll understand this article. But they don't understand, it's not something that the mind is grasping towards. It comes from the heart in a certain sense, or from the soul. It's a spiritual kind of yearning to have this new sense of self. It's often, the child is often someone who is very tied to his or her parents. And he's desperate for a little bit of independence from them. So I would say the most important thing is to assert yourself with your kid about what we think in this house and what we know to be true. And I wouldn't make it sound so fancy. You don't need to show them it, and you don't need to bring in an expert. Do not take them to the therapist. God knows what she's telling them. Most of them are doing more harm than good.
Yes.
I mean, that's what my new book is about. Most of the therapists you would bring your child to are doing more harm than good. So you're the expert. It's your kid. Take the reins and tell them what you think and what you know. And usually the younger they are, and 16 still fits into this, they still grudgingly really respect you, even if they don't want to.
Over here. Why don't we go up to the front row? I'll take a question at the far end here. A lot of questions here. Try to get as many in as possible.
Thank you. To answer the gentleman's question before, what can you do? I live in Huntington Beach. In short, we just ran 4 conservative candidates with a small team. Our town was being overrun by public sector union candidates that paid for big money. We were in a desperate state. We found 4 good candidates. We had a small team. We ran them with low bucks. We were the top 4 vote getters. The 5th place was a union teacher with $500,000 of dark PAC money. We crushed her by 12,000 votes.
And is
And
it a
we
school board or
The city council.
the city council?
We
Great.
completely control our town now. And I'm happy to announce today, Gavin Newsom sued us today over forced housing, and we sued him back.
All right. I think that's a really good point. And the other thing is start at the smallest scale. Obviously, you want the kind of Hail Mary, you want the big things, but also start at the small scale and find favorable ground. Huntington Beach is more favorable than maybe Venice Beach. There you go. So find those places where you can win. And I found that it's a lot easier to build momentum when you're winning than when you're just constantly getting smoked and losing. So find and look, you look at the kind of in the French Revolution. I was reading books about the French Revolution for a while, and one of the funny tricks that they had was the nobility that went to the countryside tended to survive the French Revolution. So this is like essentially in our time, the people who move to the suburbs are maybe going to be fine. But the deeper lesson there, besides a humorous one, is find a middle ground. Find somewhere where you can play politics and win, because that's really where things are going to start to change. And so congratulations. Amazing work. Yeah.
In the middle here, the gentleman.
This question's to Chris. Obviously, you've been collaborating with Governor DeSantis on trying to have our own so-called long march through the institutions in the state of Florida itself. But how would that translate to a plan to do that on the national level, hypothetically, if he's in the White House or the other guy in 2 years? And also, we've obviously had Republican presidents who've had majorities in both chambers of Congress since 1968, which is when you said things really started turning for the worse. Reagan had it, Bush had it. So why didn't they do the things that hopefully the next one will do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first of all, I'm pretty convinced that we're in the same historical epoch since 1968 to the present. The fundamentals have not changed at all. And the more research I did for the book, looking at that time period, the same questions that were the questions that had emerged at that time are the same questions we're answering today. I think Nixon actually holds a lot of answers and a lot of wisdom. It's kind of astonishing to think that he came from California, looking back. But so I think that's there. But look, I think Governor DeSantis is a different kind of animal. I mean, he's built very differently. His mind works very differently. He's a man of action, more in the vein of Teddy Roosevelt than a George H.W. Bush, in a very good way, in my view. And I think we have to, on the policy side, we have to get ready. And so one of the things, don't tell anyone, tomorrow, with Raihan and I are hosting a conference here for a day and a half, a private gathering of 10 of the top policy minds in the country. And we're going to start designing a de-wokification agenda. Should there be a change in power in 2024, we're going to have kind of a crack team, an A-team, of policy minds that are going to start now working on an idea. You get Congress, you get the White House, what do executive orders look like? How can you take this idea of de-wokification and extend it all the way through the federal bureaucracy, and then start doing big actions on the federal budget, trying to maybe even think about reforms to civil rights law. And so that thinking is being done, and we have to be doing much more of it. Yeah.
All right, time for maybe 2 more questions. So this gentleman's had his hand up a number of times. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Couple of things. Mothers for Liberties in June, too. School board meetings, right?
Yes.
I'm a big fan of James Lindsay. Great book is The Marxism of Education. Simple, and he's genius. So anyway, I've immersed myself in that for the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm a psychologist, and I'm finding that a lot of my clients, young clients, are half woke and half capitalist, kind of a chimera. And I know that there's a real, once you help them get what they want and link, and the biggest thing is to link freedom and responsibility and help them adapt to this amazing system that we have. That's what I think is resolving the dilemma, getting them out of the victim identity. That's the main thing. So I just wanted to ask you, as far as the what's going on in the universities, do you have the cultural, I feel like I'm going right in at the level of culture. Do you have that cultural problem with the existing students?
At New College of Florida?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, the governor deliberately picked the university with the largest cultural problem in the state of Florida, and then said, "You guys go fix that." So, yeah, it's there, and I think the victim narrative is so powerful. And the reason why I think the social contagion that Abigail was talking about is so powerful is because it gives liberal white women, just to put a point on it, access to a victim identity. And so you can choose a non-binary, trans, pansexual, whatever you want to be. There's 156 kind of varieties now. It gives them access to participate in a victim narrative at a much deeper level. And so you would know better than I would, is how do you get people out of that? How do you start to create people? I think you have to ultimately show people that if they want to be successful, if they want to feel integrated, if they want to be confident, if they want to be happy, that's just not going to cut it. Yeah.
Right, and I do that all the time, and I'd be more than happy to help you and Ron DeSantis.
All right, thank you.
All right, well, it's good.
Thank
Last
you.
question.
All right,
We have
yeah.
time for one more. Who else over here? Sure.
All right.
Sorry, we have a lot of questions, but we're out of time.
So my question's for Abigail. So over the last 50 years, we've had several instances where clinicians, social workers, cops, the state have promoted iatrogenic mental illnesses. I'm thinking of dissociative identity disorder, recovered memories, satanic ritual abuse.
Right.
But they managed to walk them back. So what lessons can we draw from that for the ones we're experiencing now?
Right. So, so this is very much both my last book and my next book. That's exactly right. And that's how I think a lot of people expected this to get walked back. We thought, oh, this will end in the courts, right? Because good men of science and women of science will step forward and go to courts and say, this isn't right. This is not scientific. This is nonsense. There is no proof of repressed memory. In fact, memories are more vivid if they've been traumatic. And they testified in courts. And then the bad experts were eventually thrown out. And there were lawsuits, for people who, and there were, convictions that were overturned in the case of, all the people who had been, so many people who had been put into jail based on faulty memories. But things are really different today. And here's how. Somebody said to me I was speaking somewhere, a couple weeks ago, and a doctor came up to me and said, basically, is this going to end like the last one did with the malpractice suits? And I said, no. And I said, the reason is look at the names of the doctors testifying. It's the same 3 names. All that the other side needs to do is disqualify 3 very smart people. Eventually they will. It's not that hard. These are brilliant minds, very good people. It's not that hard. We have all the organizations, and also they're following medical protocols. When you affirm a child, now if you say to a kid, oh, okay, you say you need a liposuction even though you weigh 80 pounds as a woman, I'm not going to go along with that. But we have laws in 22 states maybe now that make that, conversion therapy bans that prohibit a psychologist from saying that I don't think your problem is gender dysphoria. And we have very few doctors who are willing to go against these protocols in court. It's the same 3 or 4 people every time. And when they go to interview them, it's the same people I interviewed in my book. So the next article and the one after that, they're just recycling the same people I talked to. And it's not because they're not good journalists. It's because they can't find anybody willing to go on under their own name. That's a huge problem today. And the problem is we're bashful, but the other side isn't. So they're going after, and they're teaching medical students that they don't necessarily know if someone's a woman or a male or female. They're not bashful. So unfortunately, we're way too timid about what we actually know to be true, and the evangelists for wokeism are not timid at all.
Thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panelists.